A wet, copper-tasting smudge of grease marked Nora's left sleeve before the first alert sounded. She did not clean it off. She kept her right hand flat on the cooling terminal line while the bulkhead panels behind her groaned under sudden, heavy pressure. The emergency red strip across the ceiling flared once, turned the iron floors a dull shade of rust, and died. Commander Vance shifted his 7-foot frame across the threshold of the secondary climate nexus, his obsidian fur rising against the cold air. His scarred jaw tightened as he raised his standard kinetic rifle toward the shaking door. The outer ring seals just failed, Vance said, his ears twitching in micro-intervals toward the ventilation shaft. We have less than 3 minutes before the breach team clears this corridor. Nora did not look up from the terminal screen. She punched a 3-digit override code into the primary logic frame and locked the western pressure gate with a heavy, manual slap of her palm. They will not clear this corridor, she said, her voice dropping into the quiet rhythm she used during tactical drills. They will take the service elevator because I just vented the main hall. The iron gate hissed shut, its heavy lock dropping into place with a sharp metallic snap. We were trapped in a 4-meter space with an army outside, yet Nora began entering a new set of climate variables into her slate. Would you have held your ground while your blood pooled on the iron plating? She didn't look down. Stay close. 5 weeks before the Esraka marauders attached their breaching pods to Outpost Zephyr, Vance had placed his heavy tactical pack under a wooden bench in the main orientation crucible. The facility was huge, built with wide, high corridors to accommodate the massive physical frames of 46 Premier Hunter lines from across the sector. Vance counted the lines as they filed into the hall, his natural predator instincts mapping every potential threat in the room. The heavy Torvon warriors claimed the center rows, their bone-plated foreheads gleaming under the blue light as they stretched their thick arms to assert territorial dominance over the desks. To their left, 3 Dreth Shadow Adepts merged with the darker corners of the chamber, their skin pigments cycling through defensive green shades to establish immediate ambush lines. Near the front, the Sakari hunters linked their compound vision, their thousands of eyes scanning the room to form a collective security grid. Every apex species followed the same evolutionary program, marking their territory, showing their size, and preparing for competition. Then Vance saw the human female sitting entirely still in the final row. Nora wore a simple, unaugmented grey field uniform with no visible blades or neural enhancements. She did not lean forward, she did not scan the room for exits, and she did not change her posture when a massive Torvon warrior took the desk directly ahead of her. She simply read a thin data slate, her eyes moving steadily from left to right at an identical speed, completely contained within her own space. Vance found himself turning toward her every few seconds without intending to do so, his ears flattening slightly as his hindbrain triggered a soft, persistent alert. He sat down beside Karath, a younger tundra hunter whose white fur was already stiff with tension. "Do you see her?" Vance whispered, keeping his voice beneath the audio frequency of the instructors. Karath did not turn his head, but his ears twitched backward toward the last row. "My tracking sight keeps resetting on her desk," he muttered, his claws digging shallow grooves into the composite table. "She has no armor. She has no venom. Why can I not look away from her?" The baseline rules of our predator doctrine were broken during the first simulation exercise 3 days later. The Academic Council loaded a standard hostage recovery scenario on the central grid, tasking Vance's mixed squadron with clearing a simulated fortified outpost held by 18 mercenaries. Vance immediately outlined a rapid pack assault strategy, planning to use his sprint speed to overwhelm the front gates while Sorval, the Dreth adept, dropped from the ceiling panels to eliminate the lookouts. Nora listened to the plan without moving her hands from her slate. "The mercenary squad is optimized for high-burst combat," she said when Vance finished speaking. "If you charge the gate, their automated turrets will identify your body heat within 2 seconds. Your speed will not clear the kill box." Vance straightened, his obsidian chest plates expanding. "My line has run down glacier cats across 50 kilometers of broken ice. We move faster than their targeting computers can track." Not inside an iron box, Nora replied, her tone conversational. She cleared Vance's assault routes from the holographic map and replaced them with the station's environmental layout. The air cycler on this outpost operates on a 90-minute interval. When it flushes the system, it creates a loud noise burst that raises the local sound level by 22 decibels. If we wait 40 minutes, we can walk through the western junction without drawing their focus. Sorval's skin flickered with irritation. We are hunters. We do not sit in the dark for 40 minutes to avoid a fight. You will sit in the dark if you want to win, Nora said, her fingers locking the new parameters into the simulation core. The ambient temperature in their sector is set to 18 degrees. The mercenaries require 26 degrees to maintain peak muscle function. After 16 hours of continuous alertness in a cold room, their reaction times will drop by 15%. We are not going to overpower their armor. We are going to wait until their bodies fail them. Vance spent that evening in the station's archive terminal, searching the deep registries for records of prior human defensive strategies. His claws tapped a rhythmic cadence against the metal housing as he cleared 3 layers of restricted encryption. He found a single, classified tactical log from an engagement called Fortress Caraxes, dated 2 decades before the expansion treaty. 14 human operators had held a research outpost against 2,000 shock troops for 11 months. The file contained no reports of massive artillery strikes or heroic frontline charges. Instead, the logs detailed a systematic, grinding campaign of structural manipulation. The humans had lowered the base temperature by a fraction of a degree every 3 days, altered the internal lighting intervals to shatter the enemy's sleep cycles, and left short notes in the dark corridors that read, "We are still awake." Vance read the final medical summary 3 times before closing the slate. The human skeleton was structurally engineered to tolerate progressive biological degradation without losing cognitive focus. They did not optimize for short, explosive output. They optimized for the walk that outlasted the clock. The memory of that archive file vanished when the primary hull plating of Outpost Zephyr buckled with a sound like tearing metal. Esraka marauders struck during the deepest point of the station's maintenance cycle, clamping 5 massive breaching pods onto the outer habitat ring. The sudden impact cut the main power lines, plunging the interior into a deep, blood-red emergency glow. Broad-spectrum jamming filled the local comm networks with a thick layer of static, leaving Vance's squadron isolated in Sector 9. "The main command line is dead," Karath said, skidding into the intersection where Vance and Nora were tracking the structural failure. The Torvon detachment charged the primary breach point on Level 4. They were cut down by heavy energy fire within 90 seconds. Nora adjusted the tactical harness over her shoulder, her face catching the crimson reflection of the emergency lights. "The Torvon fought their strength against a sprint assault," she said, her voice cutting through the distant rumble of plasma fire. "We are abandoning Level 4. Karath, gather the remaining Vashkari lines and fall back to the climate nexus. Sorval, take your shadow units into the ventilation shafts. Do not engage, just report their coordinates." Vance grabbed her arm as she turned toward the control ladder. "We cannot give up the main armory without a fight. If they take the core grid, they control the station defenses." "They will control nothing but empty metal," Nora said, pulling away from his grip with a short, efficient movement. "The Esraka are an explosive force. They burn their energy early. We are going to make them walk through 3 kilometers of sealed bulkheads before they see a single target." The next 4 hours became a slow, invisible countdown that measured the biological decay of the invaders. Nora sat in the secondary climate nexus, using the hacking tools Prith had left behind to manipulate the station's interior environment. She dropped the ambient temperature to 8 degrees below standard, turning the wide steel corridors into a freezing labyrinth that forced the cold-blooded Esraka raiders to burn their caloric reserves just to maintain core body heat. Vance watched the tactical layout on Nora's terminal screen. The red dots representing the marauder squads were moving with precision early on, clearing rooms in tight, disciplined formations. But by the 3rd hour, Their movement patterns began to scatter. The station's automated air cycler, now locked on a randomized loop by Nora's overrides, slammed the ventilation gates every 7 minutes, broadcasting a deafening structural shudder through the deck plates that denied the attackers a single moment of quiet coordination. Sorvel's voice crackled through the short-range comms from the ceiling lines. The Vanguard squad in Corridor 7 is slowing down. Their weapons are wavering. They're firing at the automated maintenance drones. Let them fire, Nora replied, her hand adjusting the local lighting grid to strobe at an irregular interval that disrupted the reptilian optical systems of the raiders. Every round they spend on a drone is a round they do not have for the climax. Vance, take 3 of your hunters and show yourselves at the end of the western crossing. Run when they raise their sights. Vance led his pack through the red-lit passage, his claws clicking against the frost-rimmed floor. He spotted a 6-limbed S-Raka squad leader whose crimson armor was covered in a thin layer of condensation. The marauder raised his heavy plasma rifle, his compound eyes wide and bloodshot, but his movements were heavy, his limbs shaking from hours of continuous alertness in the creeping cold. Vance let out a sharp, mocking hunting howl, turned on his heel, and sprinted down the escape hatch before the first plasma bolt cleared the corner. The S-Raka squad pursued them into the Nexus crossing, their heavy boots slamming against the iron decking in a ragged, desperate rhythm. They rounded the corner into Sector 9 just as Nora locked the secondary pressure gates, separating the invaders into isolated 3-man groups. That was when the cross-corridor ambush opened. A hidden S-Raka rear guard cut through the lower maintenance panel, firing a wild burst of kinetic slugs that shattered the primary logic terminal. A jagged piece of secondary shrapnel sheared through Nora's left shoulder, driving her small frame hard against the bare steel wall. Vance fired his rifle twice, neutralizing the flanking raider before the intruder could level his weapon. He dropped to his knees beside Nora, his obsidian fur soaking in the dark fluid that was quickly staining her grey uniform. "You are hit," Vance said, his hands reaching for her field dressing. "I need to evacuate you to the medical bay on level 2. Nora's teeth click-clacked together from the cold, but her eyes remained fixed on the ticking clock at the bottom of her broken slate. She pushed Vance's hands away with her functional arm, her fingers dragging across the bloody keys of the manual console. "No rapid strikes," she whispered, her breath forming a grey cloud in the freezing room. "No glorious charges. No escape for the broken lines." She forced her body upright against the iron panel, her face entirely pale under the emergency red glow. She did not scream, she did not enter a defensive state of shock, and she did not curse the enemy. She simply used her right hand to input the final climate parameters, lowering the local sector's oxygen levels by 4% while sealing the S-Raka squad leader inside the central killbox. "The time window is open," Nora said, her voice dropping to a dry rasp as she looked up at Vance. "Their 6-hour peak performance limit just expired. Go finish it." Vance rose to his full height, his rifle locked against his chest as the heavy pressure gate hissed open. He led the remaining Tundra hunters through the red mist of the corridor, their speed hitting its maximum output for the first time in the long night. They found Warlord Kalen standing in the center of the secondary climate nexus, his 6 limbs trembling under the weight of his chitinous crimson armor. The Marauder commander did not raise his plasma blade when Vance cleared the threshold. His compound infrared eyes were hollow, staring blankly at the frost-covered ceiling, while his metabolic vents pumped heavy, erratic streams of steam into the frozen air. His elite vanguard sat against the bulkheads, their weapons resting across their knees, their hands shaking so violently they could no longer grip their ammunition packs. Vance stepped past the shattered threshold and slapped the heavy blade from Kalen's hand with a single sweep of his claw. The warlord dropped to the deck without a fight, his body surrendering to the total metabolic collapse that Nora had spent 6 hours cultivating in the dark. A secondary signal flared on Vance's slate, indicating an incoming transport ship carrying an anomalous rescue manifest from the deep sector, but the immediate threat was dead. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the outpost's primary air system. The Galactic Relief Fleet dropped out of transit space 2 hours later, their medical teams moving through the wide corridors with their weapons raised in high alert formations. They stopped in Sector 9, their scanners registering the freezing internal temperature and the long rows of S-Raka raiders sitting quietly under the guard of a few Tundra cadets. A heavy Torvon admiral walked through the scorched intersections, his thick finger tracing the operational timeline Nora had recorded on the main core before her evacuation. He stood before Vance's desk for a long moment, his bone-plated forehead lowering as he looked at the quiet human cadet who sat with her left arm bound tight in a clean field sling. They had 200 elite shock troops, the admiral said, his deep voice subdued as he watched Nora close her data slate. They possessed complete orbital dominance. Why did they stop fighting? Vance stood beside her desk, his ears straight, his obsidian fur catching the clean white light of the restored station grid. They did not stop because their weapons failed, Vance said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. They stopped because they ran out of minutes. Years later, Vance stood at the front of the primary Crucible Hall on a frosted Vanguard outpost, his scarred jaw catching the dim light of a new star system through the thick viewport. 48 fresh recruits sat in the forward desks, their ears twitching, their skin patterns shifting as they tried to assert their status in the new room. Vance activated his old tactical slate, displaying a single, straight line that tracked a slow hunting pattern across a dark grid. He pointed toward a quiet human recruit sitting entirely still in the final row, her eyes moving steadily from left to right across her screen. Every predator in this room will spend the next 3 terms learning how to strike with maximum force, Vance said, his gaze sweeping across the young warriors. You will learn the sprint, the ambush, and the heavy charge. But you will track the human in the back row because your hindbrain understands something your academies cannot teach. He stepped away from the podium, his long shadow falling over the front desks. You are prepared for an enemy that fights in a burst. You have no defense against an entity that simply follows you until you die of exhaustion. An obsidian claw, tracing a slow, straight line across a dark viewing screen.